Pilot Topics is sponsored by avtutorials.com. They offer interactive, easy-to-learn pilot training for Windows, Mac, and iPad. Now, let's join Steve and Russ.
Welcome to Quick Pilot Topics, episode number 5. I'm Steve. I'm an airline pilot, flight instructor, flight engineer, a previous examiner, and an A&P mechanic. I'm joined today by my brother Russ, who has great questions about flying, and here he is. So, Russ, what are we talking about?
We've talked about CFIT in a previous discussion. What are we talking about when we say CFIT?
Again, CFIT, like we talked about in part 1, that stands for to terrain, and it happens when an airworthy aircraft is flown by a qualified pilot into terrain or even water or obstacles with inadequate awareness on the part of the pilot of the impending collision.
Last time, we talked about scud running, which is a situation where a VFR pilot deliberately flies at low altitude, in low visibility, attempting to stay clear of clouds. It often results in a collision with terrain or obstacles. What's another example of CFIT?
Well, there's lots of cases where instrument-rated pilots operating in the IFR system lose situational awareness and collide with terrain. In short, they might not be proficient with IFR operations, or they might even exceed their personal limitations. You know, just because a pilot is instrument-rated doesn't mean they're proficient and possess the skill set to operate in the IFR system.
So, what's an example of an instrument-rated pilot that got into a CFIT accident?
Well, there are cases where pilots initiated an early missed approach, yet they failed to continue along the final approach course to the missed approach point. In other words, they broke off the final approach course early and impacted with terrain. There are also cases where pilots initiated a missed approach and entered a descent, colliding with terrain. Preoccupation with radio communications and navigation systems or flight management systems sometimes distracted them from the primary task of flying the airplane.
Mm-hmm.
You know, speaking of approaches, unstabilized approaches flown at high rates of descent have occurred. The pilot failed to level off at the required MDA and continued all the way to the ground.
Wow.
Yeah, that's right. And there are even accidents where a pilot executed a circling to land maneuver, but at an extremely low altitude below circling minimums, if you can believe that.
Nope.
One such pilot who crashed was known, among others, to practice this dangerous task, and when weather was below minimums, the pilot would continue descending until the airport was in sight, and then proceed with the circling maneuver to another runway. It finally caught up with him, where he entered a bank angle so steep that the aircraft rapidly lost altitude and crashed. Finally, there are cases where pilots lacked instrument flying skills and relied on the autopilot to do all the work. When weather deteriorated more than expected, or when things in general went to hell in a handbasket and couldn't get the autopilot to do what they needed, the pilot disconnected it and attempted to hand fly. But the lack of proficiency was too much for the pilot, and they were unable to maintain altitude and airspeed control. In these cases, a descending spiral was entered, resulting in a crash.
It doesn't sound like these instrument-rated pilots should have been flying in the IFR system or an IMC. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, there's some truth to that. IFR flight is not inherently dangerous, but it does require strict attention to procedures, large amounts of knowledge, and complete proficiency with basic attitude instrument flying. If you remove any of those elements from the equation, you have increased risk of a CFIT accident.
So, how does an instrument-rated pilot prevent a CFIT accident?
Well, several ways. First, a pilot has to be proficient with instrument flying. Basic attitude instrument flying skills really are essential, and pilots must keep those skills fresh by hand flying frequently. If a pilot relies on the autoflight system too much, those skills get rusty. Also, the pilot has to have current and proper charts aboard, either in paper or an electronic flight bag like an iPad. It also helps if a VFR sectional is carried and analyzed prior to flight for terrain and obstacles. Knowledge of minimum safe altitudes and other key altitude figures, such as a minimum off-route altitude, really help generate situational awareness.
Okay.
Next, a current and thorough weather briefing is a must, and pilots have to determine if current and forecast weather is at or above the published minimums, as well as their own personal minimums. Next, a pilot must really understand the IFR system with knowledge on how to properly execute a missed approach how to properly descend on an arrival or approach, and everything else that goes with it. Finally, a stabilized approach has to be flown. This means that a reasonable descent rate, usually 1,000 feet per minute or less, is flown at a proper approach airspeed, usually plus 10 or minus 5 knots from your normal approach speed, and other factors. So the best advice that I can give also is that if you're ever disoriented, confused, or unsure of your position, climb, climb, climb. Declare an emergency with ATC if you have to. Get the assistance you need to keep the airplane flying.
Good advice.
Absolutely. And that about covers it. We appreciate everybody listening. We hope you join us on the next episode of Quick Pilot Topics.
Visit avtutorials.com for a free 2-hour ebook audiobook titled 12 Easy Ways Pilots Get in Trouble. Remember to listen next week, and happy flying!